guys. My name is Aki. I'm the co-founder, CTO at a company called Healthzilla. We're a health tech company based out of Singapore. Now, today I'm going to talk to you about potential diagnostics for early detection of COVID-19, why that generally is something we should be working on, what are some potential candidate metrics, and so on. So we'll get into some of the research that's backing this approach, as well as look at some of the findings from Wuhan and some of the published data there on actual cases of COVID-19. For background, I come from a data science background. I'm a master's degree in computer science from Aalto University in Finland, and have been working with HRV data now for a few years, mainly through developing our own proprietary fingertip scan technology. It's not the unique app in the world that does that, but one of the only free options out there in the app stores. And what it does is basically picks up the blood volume changes in the capillary veins of your finger to then identify what's called the PPG signal, which is effectively your heartbeat captured through your finger. And there's a number of other measures that can actually be captured through that we'll get into that might be relevant to some extent. Now, how we sort of developed an idea of generally working on COVID. I mean, we're not a med tech company. We're not generally working with disease. We're working with just wellness and sort of healthy people and training, workouts, recovery, those kind of aspects of life and healthy habits and whatnot. But the reason we've gone into COVID-19 is actually that our recovery algorithm, which we call the stress score, for a number of years already has been building up a data set, partially based on existing research, as well as then labeling by actual user feedback to show whether you are healthy or experiencing, for example, acute or chronic stress, which could be then indicating potentially being sick. So we've used that just for the purpose of sort of guidance of your habits and workouts and recovery and those kind of things. So again, it's not been used in a clinical context, but that is sort of the source of the background of how we got into thinking about this problem at all. Now, the hypothesis that we have is that we believe that HRV could be used to detect asymptomatic COVID-19, right? The difference being that if we can detect that you're sick, that's great. But if you're already symptomatic, you've got a fever and cough and all that, it's not really adding a whole bunch of other information. And I don't think it's realistic to say that we could differentiate between COVID-19 or other influenza or other type of viruses. These metrics are not that accurate. I think the best we could do is detect that, hey, there's an early asymptomatic virus infection going on. And in this instance, where really the active virus everybody is worried about is COVID-19, we believe there's a good chance that we could detect something around that. So why do we care? Why don't we just test people? Obviously, we already have PCR tests, which are incredibly accurate. We have rapid field test kits as well that could be potentially distributed to people at home. The original price points coming down from maybe a few $100s down to potentially tens of dollars per test. Well, number one, there's not enough tests. At this point, with the global pandemic, we're talking about testing of not thousands of people, but potentially millions of people. So the scale of current testing logistically, cost-wise, is just not there yet. The other thing is right now, partially because there's few tests, they're only being used on symptomatic people. So if you're in most countries and you're not experiencing symptoms, even if you want to get tested, you're willing to pay for it, you probably won't be able to get tested because they're saving tests for asymptomatic people. So the trouble with that is we don't really understand the full spread of the virus. Of course, we have estimates on the R0 number, which indicates the spread of the virus from case to case. But since we haven't really tested wide populations of asymptomatic people, we don't really know fully how many people have it around the world, right? Confirmed numbers as of today that I know of are over 1 million confirmed. But how big is the real number? That's the question. And of course, the reason knowing the real number matters is if, for example, you tested 10,000 people at random, say in a place like New York, this is something that Peter T has been talking about the past few days. If 50% of those asymptomatic people test positive for COVID-19, then it sort of means we have not that much to worry about because the real mortality rates are then going to be extremely low, much lower than estimated thus far. Whereas if 1% of asymptomatic people test positive, that means we're in trouble, because then it means that there's still a lot of infected people out there, and the mortality rates are actually going to be very high. So that's why that matters. Now, the other thing is, of course, in some ways, we're quite lucky that the virus has played out the way it is. Obviously, it's a massive global tragedy, trillions of dollars lost in the economy already, potentially a global recession. It's a horror show. But if we're honest about it, it could be worse. This is not the theoretical maximum worst combination of viral parameters. But at the same time, we still have to worry about recurrence. We have to worry about seasonality. So this could be a thing that, like the influenza, comes and goes, with the seasons every year or two. We have to look at potentially mutation, right? So the parameters could change for the worse, and suddenly the mortality or the infection rate, other parameters, the incubation period suddenly changes and creates new havoc. The treatments or vaccines we might have at some point would go out the window. And last, but certainly not least, we could have other novel viruses, right? So this is a real wake-up call for the world, but it's not like this is the last virus that's ever going to come out. So I think this is really showing us, like if you look at Bill Gates' pandemic TED talk from, I believe, 5 years ago, it's sort of telling us that this could happen. Now it's really happened. It's real. So now we have to put in place a whole host of different types of new systems and infrastructure to make sure next time the world is more prepared. So what can we do? Obviously, a vaccine, that's the real solution here. But, given what we know right now, there's no short-term visibility on any vaccines coming out into the market. Treatments are being looked at, but again, we don't really know what's going to be available in what time periods. Right now, everybody's talking about flattening the curve, and obviously that is, the best and really only solution at this point. So you've seen the graph. I'll probably pull it up here just in case you haven't seen that for some context. But what we're talking about here is really preventing the exponential growth and trying to flatten that curve by social distancing, isolation, lockdowns, these kind of things which are now going around the world. Now, the last thing that we can do is obviously non-invasive diagnostics, which we're going to talk about today. Now, there's a few candidate metrics that we've looked at already, and there's pretty good body of literature around them. So I'll pull up some specific studies, and we'll probably attach a blog post to this video so that you can actually go and find those links to those studies and check them out for yourself. The first maybe most obvious, most familiar metric would be resting heart rate. Everybody has a sort of general handle on what their heart rate is at various times. You sort of know the biological ranges from 30 and 40 from professional athletes all the way to 200 if you're really pushing yourself during exercise, and the sort of normal being something between the two. Resting heart rate, of course, being typically the night or morning measurement for stability, because the real world environment, your heart rate can vary greatly depending on your activity. So you want to take a stable resting measurement. Recently, just this year, actually, Fitbit did a study with 200,000 users, a really large number of users, and they actually looked at influenza. And what they can see is there's a strong correlation between a rise in their users' resting heart rates during influenza season. So again, it's more of a correlation, but it's not really a predictive tool per se, but again, shows that there is clear, strong correlation between illness and even resting heart rate, which is not a very sensitive measure. Now, the second and sort of primary metric here is heart rate variability. Most of you would be familiar with it. Got my Oura Ring here. Apple Watch measures it. Garmin devices measure it. There's a lot of wearables that measure it, and our app Healthzilla, Welltory, HRV for training. There's a few different apps that measure through the fingertip, like I mentioned before. Now, the reason HRV has become such a popular metric, especially with athletes, the past few years, is that it's a very sensitive measure of your body's general state. Now, it is actually a measure of the influence that your autonomic nervous system is having on your heartbeat. So again, heart rate variability is the well, there's a few different measures, but say it's one popular measure is the standard deviation of actually the interbeat intervals between your heartbeats. So a healthy heart is actually not beating regularly. There's a bit of variation between the beats, and this is what heart rate variability is actually capturing. So, for example, if you're on your deathbed, your heart rate variability is almost zero, which means your autonomic nervous system's kind of given up in a sense. It has no control over heartbeat. You're in sort of full automatic mode, whereas a healthy system is actually highly variable. So the higher the better, generally speaking, with heart rate variability. Now, there's a couple of studies that give us some hope or promise when it comes to potentially detecting viral infections. Now, one of them is that they have shown in several studies an inverse correlation with inflammatory markers in HRV. The reason that's relevant is, of course, viral infections, including COVID-19, have been shown in actual clinical evaluations out of Wuhan, for example, to show high levels of inflammatory markers. So even if we can't really detect the virus directly, this is an indirect path for us to detect. As soon as your inflammatory markers start going up, we should see changes in your HRV. Now, perhaps even more interestingly, there's a study in 2012 by pairing that even in influenza vaccination, which is a mild strain of the virus, can be picked up in your HRV. So that tells us if that's sort of a mini infection, if you will, from the vaccine, you would imagine then a real infection which shows similar, if not stronger, characteristics. Whether that shows up in symptomatic and asymptomatic, that's the $1,000,000 question in this case. Now, perhaps the most specific result that we've seen is actually around sepsis. So there's a study in 2009 by Ahmad showing that in sepsis, which is again, this is a deadly condition. I'm not making any sort of direct comparison with sepsis and COVID-19, but just to show that in this sort of acute inflammatory state, this can be detected via HRV up to 35 hours pre-diagnosis. So before you can really tell from the symptoms that sepsis is taken on, you're able to detect it with the HRV. This is really the sort of direction that we're hoping to see with COVID-19. So another metric we would like to look at is respiratory rate, not necessarily from the point of view of early diagnostics or being able to detect asymptomatic COVID-19, but more from the point of view that this is something that would help us understand the time course, especially as it relates to predicting severe cases requiring ventilation or ICU support, because this is really, if we look at places like Italy, this is driving a lot of the mortality in the places that have the highest spread of the virus. So if there's something we could do there above and beyond just detection, I think that would be very helpful for remote monitoring and those kind of purposes. In a book by Jenis in 1989, it says that any respiratory rate above 20 per minute is generally associated with a diagnosis of pneumonia. So, for example, if you have symptoms of, shortness of breath, etc., then respiratory rate is something that we'd like to track, and in fact is also something that we can measure through the same fingertip signal, as well as the heart rate and the HRV. The final metric, which is something we've heard anecdotal evidence about specifically around COVID-19, is SpO2 or blood oxygen. And apparently doctors are already using it as a general purpose metric to determine case severity. So normally SpO2 is a very stable metric. So in healthy people, it's kind of useless. You don't really see anything there. But it's also one of those metrics that if you suddenly see a drop of several percentage points, that's something serious. And the way that COVID-19 is affecting the lungs and your ability to breathe and oxygenate, you can sort of see logically how that would make sense, that there's less oxygen in your blood suddenly. So that's a metric that we could use, again, for more remote monitoring and sort of evaluation of treatment, potentially. Now, something else we'd obviously love to measure is symptoms. So if we're looking at asymptomatic, we have to differentiate between people who have symptoms and don't have symptoms. So therefore, we need to capture that information around the common symptoms, be it shortness of breath, fever, cough, etc. Now, to be a little bit more specific finally here on COVID-19, what does the time course look like? What do we think we can detect? Generally speaking, viral infections have two stages of viremia. There's primary viremia, where the virus actually enters the body, goes into the bloodstream, and finds a place to replicate. In the case of COVID-19, that seems to be commonly the throat. So people typically, that's one of the first symptoms people get, is the sore throat. And from there, secondary viremia is where the virus re-enters the blood, having reproduced, and then finds really the sort of final landing spot, which in the case of COVID-19 would be the lungs, heart, gut commonly. So we think it's unlikely we can pick up the initial infection in the primary viremia because they will be quite subtle. It's likely that when we look at the sort of biomarkers like inflammatory markers that we already talked about, we've seen reports of even double sort of average values in C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 compared to less severe cases. So this is a study out of Wuhan from Kim, I think in March. So these show that it's likely we would be able to pick up that sudden spike in the inflammatory markers, which would then be closer to secondary viremia. Now, the critical point here is how does this relate to the onset of symptoms? And are we talking a few hours difference or a few days difference? If it's a few hours difference, this early detection metric would be interesting but not particularly useful. But if it's a few days that we can pick up the signal, then it's something meaningful. Of course, it still does mean it's very unlikely we would be able to detect or create a metric where you could just download an app and immediately say yes or no. It's not a replacement for a test. You would have to use the app while you're asymptomatic and would have to look out for changes in your HRV compared to your baseline. So anywhere from a few days to a week at least of data before we can sort of make any judgment on is this person experiencing something like a viral infection based on their data? So that's the sort of best case scenario. Of course, we would want to look at pneumonia, as I mentioned. Looking at the data from Wuhan. Usually, people who go to the hospital, that happens in a sort of median time of 7 days or a week after the first symptoms onset. And for those cases who need really ICU support, that's in sort of 10 to 11 day time frame on average. So meaning, this thing is still playing out the sort of time course for COVID-19, despite the asymptomatic cases. It's a disease in the weeks, not just in the days. So meaning solutions for long-term remote monitoring seem like that would be a good idea. Now, in terms of our ask, what are we looking for here? Aura's already doing their study. It's amazing. They're issuing 2,000 rings to sort of healthcare workers in the U.S. and opening that up to all Aura users. So anybody with a ring can sign up to that. But the thing is, as far as we know, they're building a data set for sample data, just like Fitbit did. So they will get HRV data, granted sleep data, very interesting data around temperature and whatnot. But it's not a raw signal data set. So the thing we're trying to do with the fingertip scan is actually build a data set of raw waveform data, so that's a data set that we could then give access to researchers and hospitals who want to do their own studies or come up with their own metrics for this as well. The benefit, of course, is if you do something through just the smartphone app and the camera, it's scalable. As a free app, there's virtually no limit to how much data you could gather and how quickly you could do it if you just get it out there. So what we're really looking for is, of course, healthy people, symptomatic people, both cases, to use the app to build up the data set. We're obviously looking to get this data set into the hands of researchers, hospitals. So anybody in those spheres, please contact us. We're looking to also develop tools for hospitals for remote monitoring of patients and potentially collaborating with governments for local monitoring of asymptomatic cases. And finally, if there's any other technology partners or investors looking to play a part in this, please contact us. Thanks for your time.